Well, it's my pleasure to introduce, and again, I really loved your presentation, Larry. At this point,
Thank you.
I'll introduce Professor Jessica Walker. Jessica Walker is an assistant professor of history at McMurray University. She has a master's degree in history from Oxford and a PhD from Johns Hopkins. Her dissertation explored cultivating popular perceptions of female queenship in 16th century. She's a recipient of numerous funding awards from the Huntington and Folger Shakespeare Libraries, the Mellon Foundation, and the National Endowment of the Humanities. It's my pleasure to welcome Jessica Walker.
Okay, thank you.
Everybody.
I'll just mute you all and then you have to unmute yourself, Jessica.
So first I want to thank Duncan and David and Kenneth and Nelia for inviting me to be a part of this. It's a big honor, and I'd like to thank everyone for letting me be a part of your community. So this has been a really amazing experience. If you've ever been to a history conference, then you'll know that historians are paper readers and not storytellers. So this is actually my first time trying to tell a story, so please bear with me. So today I want to tell you a story about the past, but it's a story that resonates with this global narrative that we're living and we're also creating right now, both in the COVID pandemic and also in the global water crisis. So my story starts in the summer of 1854 in London's Soho district. It was hot, it was filthy, it was overcrowded, and there was an almost palpable sense of panic in the air. Somewhere in the slums, a baby boy had died. This was not an uncommon occurrence in 19th century, especially in poor communities, and it often went unnoticed by wider society. But this one was different. According to the rumors, the baby had symptoms that were all too familiar to the Londoners. He had the symptoms of cholera. Within just a few weeks, over 600 people had died in the Soho area alone. One of the scariest things about cholera is how quickly it kills. People wake up in the morning feeling totally fine, and by nightfall, they're dead. The time in between is absolute agony. It starts with intense abdominal pain, followed by almost continuous vomiting and diarrhea. This causes extreme dehydration, and pretty soon the person lapses into unconsciousness and dies. Sometimes they die within a few days, sometimes it's only a few hours. The residents of Soho would have been well aware of what happened. Most of them were squashed together in tenements with paper-thin walls, so they would have seen and heard their friends and family as they suffered. Plus, they'd already witnessed an outbreak of cholera about 20 years before. Another thing that made cholera truly terrifying was that nobody knew what caused it or how it spread, and there was no cure. Scientists were working around the clock to figure it out, but they weren't having any luck. Meanwhile, doctors were prescribing all the remedies they could think of, things like mustard and tobacco enemas and even opium, but nothing seemed to be working. And 2 out of 3 patients still died in a pool of their own bodily fluids. The dominant theory by far was that the disease was spread by a miasma. This was basically a toxic fog that crept over the area, silently engulfing everything in its path. In the case of cholera, it literally sucked the life out of people, leaving their shriveled gray shells behind in its wake. The miasma theory held that the illness was airborne and it was transmitted through a foul smell. And Victorian London was home to a truly incomprehensible odor. Like the miasma theory, which was the major explanation for the Black Death 500 years before, the city's sanitation system was a relic of the medieval past. London as we know it was founded by the ancient Romans, who had pretty sophisticated plumbing, including aqueducts and indoor toilets. But when they left Londinium in the 5th century, they took their toilet technology with them. Over 1,000 years later, waste disposal pretty much consisted of a bucket and a window. There was no such thing as taking a pleasant stroll through the streets of London, except in the fancy bits with the huge houses and the big parks. Instead, the city was like an obstacle course where the challenge was to make it through this maze of winding medieval roads while dodging yellow showers and projectile turds to make it to your destination unsoiled. The streets were lined with shallow channels on either side where the rain was supposed to collect and eventually get flushed out, but the system was far from perfect. The sludge that did get washed away would flow downhill and eventually end up in the River Thames, where it swilled back and forth with the tide instead of washing out to sea. On top of that, slaughterhouse scraps and industrial waste were also dumped into the river, making it not so much a body of water as a festering toxic stew. The Londoners weren't apathetic to this sight or immune to the smell, but the population had grown to the point where the city just couldn't cope with the waste. Several centuries before, they tried to take care of the problem by digging huge holes underneath their houses and then dumping their business down there. The wealthier sort could hire people called gong farmers to shovel it up and take it away, but they charged a pretty penny for their services, and they pretty much priced themselves out of business. By the 19th century, gong farming was a thing of the past, and the cesspits beneath people's houses were full to the brim. Meanwhile, despite outward appearances, modernity had come to London. The upper crust were embracing modern convenience in the form of indoor plumbing, complete with running water and newfangled contraptions called water closets, i.e. toilets. These necessitated water pipes and new sewers, which workers often laid side by side to make things a little bit easier. Not to miss an entrepreneurial opportunity, water companies sprang up, and they competed over claims that they provided the purest, the tastiest, and as one put it, the most elevating water on the market. No less than 6 of these big companies drew their water straight out of the Thames. To top it off, the sewers and the cesspits also leaked into the drinking water, making for a toxic cocktail that even the most primitive medieval resident wouldn't dream of drinking. The Londoners, of course, didn't know about the finer points of their new plumbing. As with all new technology, only the rich could afford the indoor kind, but the poor had access to outdoor pumps every few blocks. In the districts of Soho, the pump on Broad Street gained a reputation for having some of the best tasting water. In fact, some locals would actually walk past other pumps to get their water from that one. Not only was water a basic life necessity, it had recently become something of a commodity and even a symbol of modernity. So when a few people proposed that the cholera might be carried in the water, many people just didn't want to hear it. But with a fresh outbreak in 1854, people were desperate for a cure. One of those weirdos who suspected that water might be the culprit, the physician named John Snow, and he hatched a brand new plan to figure out where it was coming from. He sent men to canvass neighborhoods and ask around about who was sick, who had died, and where they had lived. Then he started to plot the house of every single person who died on a map. Pretty soon, he was staring at a picture that sure seemed to confirm his theory. His dots were clustered around water pumps, and they practically obscured the whole area around that sweet pump on Broad Street, which was close to where the baby had lived. To double check, Snow sent his men back out to ask some follow-up questions. It turned out that pretty much everybody in the area who died drank water from that particular pump. On the other hand, the very few unmarked spots on Snow's map were mostly the houses of brewery workers who drank beer instead of water. The traditional version of the story ends with Jon Snow convincing everyone that cholera was spread by waterborne microorganisms rather than this evil odor. The handle of the pump was removed, a fancy new sewer system was constructed to finally take care of all the crap, and thousands of lives were saved. But if you poke at this nice, neat narrative, it'll start to unravel. The epidemic of 1854 wasn't the first or even the worst that London had seen. In fact, it was just a tiny episode during a worldwide cholera pandemic that spanned most of the 19th century, but it is the most famous, and that's because of how we've restoried it. Jon Snow was actually still working with the miasma theory, only he thought the illness was conveyed by water instead of air. It would still be a few more decades before bacteria were discovered, accompanied by the new theories of infection. Worse yet, Snow didn't actually end the pandemic by taking the handle off the pump. It pretty much burned itself out by that point, and it would reemerge in the 1860s. To be fair, his statistical methods were groundbreaking, and he's called the father of epidemiology, but the significance of Snow's work wasn't really recognized until well after his death. The tale of Jon Snow and the Broad Street Pump has been used over the years to celebrate the triumph of science over superstition. But it's been teased out of a much bigger story that also has strands of politics, society, economics, and even imperialism. Cholera supposedly came from India, after all. If we zoom out again, we'll see that this too is just one small thread of a much wider narrative about global exchange, cultural perceptions, and the impact of industry. Instead of telling the story as a way to illustrate the supposed superiority of the Western ways of knowing, as David and Grace Ann put it, we can reuse it to restory our impact on the environment and our relationship with its resources, including clean water.
Particularly the last few moments of what you were saying, Jessica, sounded to me like a commentary on the current coronavirus and contact tracing and the impact of globalization, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if that was what you were intending. I think it probably was, but.
Absolutely. It does have so many eerie parallels to what we're living today. And you also see this recurring cholera pandemic. So this started in really the early 1800s, circa India, so they say. Again, how do we know what we think we know? And it went all the way to North America for basically the whole 19th century. And you see resurgence, and sometimes it's much worse, and there's all of this fear. So that part of it is also very much like what we're living right now.
I'm also looking as a small commentary on a bridge with the David's story, because you started your story with that cholera was killing very rapidly, and David was describing another, let's say, cholera, which is plastic, which kills way smaller, so it doesn't frighten us so much. That the research, which is pretty much same as the guy you mentioned did, just doesn't appeal to us. So in case of cholera, it was killing us quickly enough that we would react. In case of plastic, it's the same trouble, it's just too slow for us to do something about it. And it's just kind of a parallel I'm seeing between the stories.
Well, and I want to build on that, Gregor. All three stories have this link about water containing something very dangerous. Water creates this miasma. Water creates alligators, or contains alligators. It contains plastic. I think that's probably an important unconscious resistance people have to wanting to really perhaps engage in water stories more than they do. Just top of mind.